At the Riverside Club, in front of 17 people. My son said it. He said I belonged in Sunrise Gardens, not sitting at a dinner table pretending I still mattered. I set down my knife. I looked at him, and I smiled, because he had no idea what he'd just admitted to the room. The table had gone quiet, not the polite quiet of people waiting for someone to finish a sentence, the other kind, the kind that follows something that cannot be taken back. Catherine Marsh, who had been Eleanor's closest friend for 22 years, was sitting 3 seats to my left. I watched the color leave her face. She looked at me. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage and picked up my fork. Marcus was still talking. He was explaining himself to Diane, to her parents, to the 7 other couples arranged around that table like a jury that hadn't been told it was a jury saying something about practicality, about the right environment, about how Sunrise Gardens had a beautiful facility and a very attentive staff. His voice had that particular confidence of a man who has never been contradicted in front of an audience. I cut a piece of salmon. It was cooked well. I noted that. I excused myself before the salad course. No raised voice, no pushed chair. I walked to the coat-room hallway, took out my phone, and called James Morrison. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what Marcus had said, the exact words, the exact room, the 17 people present. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure you're ready to move forward?" I told him I was completely clear. He said he'd have everything prepared by Thursday. I thanked him and hung up. I walked back to the table and sat down. The salmon was still warm. Diane was watching Marcus. Marcus was watching me. I unfolded my napkin, smoothed it across my knee, and looked at neither of them. My hand on the knife was steady. It had been steady the whole time. That was the part Marcus would not understand until Thursday, that I had been steady 4 months. And tonight, he had simply given me the last thing I needed. I started Ashford Industrial Supply in 1992 with $31,000, a used pickup truck, and 12 accounts. I built it over 31 years into a regional distributor with 47 employees and contracts across the Southeast. Eleanor used to say I was the calmest man she'd ever watched be furious, that I could be completely, entirely angry and still speak in a measured voice and still solve the problem. I never thought of it as a skill. It was simply how I was built. In 2023, a firm out of Atlanta paid $187 million for what I had built. I signed the final transfer documents on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I drove home the same way I'd driven home for 31 years. Eleanor did not live to see the sale. The last time I had been inside a care facility before I bought Sunrise Gardens was the spring of 2021, when Eleanor's oncologist arranged a consultation with the palliative team at a residential unit in Boca Raton. We drove there on a Wednesday morning. Eleanor was quiet in the car. When we walked through the entrance, she looked at the corridor, the institutional lighting, the handrails along both walls, the common room with its arrangement of chairs facing a television, and she reached over and took my hand without saying anything. We sat through the consultation. The staff were professional and kind. On the drive home, Eleanor looked out at the passenger window for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "I want to die in my own house. Rob, in my own room, with the window open." I told her she would. She did. But I did not forget that corridor. I did not forget the handrails, or the chairs facing the television, or the look on her face when she took my hand, when James Morrison called me 11 months after her death to tell me Sunrise Gardens was available. I drove out to see it on a Tuesday morning in January. I walked the East Corridor and the garden paths and the memory care wing. And I thought about Eleanor's hand in mine, and about what it meant to have a place that was chosen rather than assigned. I made the offer that afternoon. That was the entirety of Ashford Industrial Supply on its first day of operation. I had rented a warehouse space in West Palm Beach, 4,000 square feet, concrete floor, 1 loading dock, a bathroom with a broken towel dispenser. I fixed myself the first morning. Eleanor had packed sandwiches for me that day. Turkey on white bread. The crusts cut off the way she'd done since we were first married. In a way I'd never asked her to do and never commented on, because some things are simply part of how a person loves you and you recognize them without needing to name them. I spent the next 31 years building that company from those 12 accounts into a regional distributor with 47 employees, 3 warehouses, and contracts with manufacturers across the Southeast. The work was not glamorous. It was deliveries and invoices and supplier negotiations and the particular kind of patience required when a client calls at 7 in the morning to tell you a shipment arrived damaged and he needs replacement parts by noon. I was good at that patience. Eleanor used to say I was the calmest man she'd ever watched be furious, that I could be completely, entirely angry, and still speak in a measured voice and still solve the problem. I never thought of it as a skill. It was simply how I was built. By 2015, the company was generating $11 million in annual revenue. By 2020, it was closer to 18. I had offers every few years from private equity groups and regional consolidators, and I turned them all down, not because I was unreasonable about money, but because I knew exactly what I had built, and I was not willing to watch someone else dismantle it for parts. In 2023, when I was 66 years old, a firm out of Atlanta made an offer I could not find a rational reason to refuse. The number was $187 million. I signed the final transfer documents on a Tuesday afternoon in March, in a conference room that smelled like recycled air. I drove home the same way I'd driven home for 31 years. Eleanor did not live to see the sale. She had been the reason I kept building, and also the reason I had made a particular mistake for most of those years, the mistake of believing that there would always be more time. We had lived in a series of reasonable houses throughout our marriage, each one slightly larger than the last. Each one Eleanor's project to turn into something that felt like a home. She never complained about the houses. She made curtains and planted gardens and painted the kitchen in a color she'd spent 3 weeks deciding on. And she did all of it without asking me to slow down or sell the company or take a vacation. She understood what I was building, and she supported it completely. What she wanted, what she mentioned, once, in 2011, in a way that was not a request but simply a fact she was placing on the table, was a house that was hers from the beginning. Not a house she had made into something. A house she had chosen. I bought the property on Cypress Lane in Palm Beach in the spring of 2020. 11 rooms, a back garden that Eleanor walked through twice before we closed, a kitchen with windows that faced east so the morning light came straight across the counter. The price was $8.2 million. Eleanor stood in the back garden on the day we got the keys and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Rob, I think this is the one." She said it as if she'd been looking for a long time, which she had for 29 years. She had been looking without ever making me feel the weight of that weight. She got 14 months in that house. The diagnosis came in the fall of 2020, pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The oncologist was a careful man who explained the options without offering false comfort, and I respected him for it. Eleanor went through treatment with the same steadiness she had brought to everything in her life, and for a while, the numbers looked better, and then they didn't. By the spring of 2021, she was spending most of her time in the back bedroom, the one with the window that looked out over the garden she had planted the previous summer. The roses were coming in. She could see them from the bed. I sat with her in that room for 18 hours a day in the last weeks. I am not a man who expresses himself easily in words, and Eleanor had always known this, and she had never required it of me. I held her hand. I read to her when she wanted that and was silent when she didn't. I watched the light change across the garden through that window morning light, afternoon light, the long, flat gold of Florida evenings, and I thought about the 31 years we had spent building something together, and how the house had come at the end of it, and how 14 months was not enough, and how it was what we had, and how she had never once made me feel that it wasn't. Eleanor died on a Thursday in June 2021. She was 64 years old. She died in the back bedroom of the house she had chosen, with the window open and the smell of the garden coming through. I was 66 years old and alone in an 11-room house. The weeks after her death had a particular quality I had not anticipated, not grief exactly, or not only grief, but a kind of spatial disorientation. I had spent 31 years in motion, and now I was not. I walked through rooms that still held the evidence of Eleanor's choices, the curtain fabric she had spent a Saturday selecting, the painting above the fireplace she had found at a gallery in Delray Beach, the kitchen shelves she had arranged with a precision that looked casual and was not. I did not rearrange any of it. I was not ready to, and I was not certain I would ever be. It was in those months, the fall and winter of 2021, when I was moving through the house like a man learning a new language, that I began to think clearly about what I needed to protect. I had built 31 years of work into $187 million. I had a house worth $8.2 million. I had my health, my mind, and the particular kind of clarity that comes from having survived something you weren't certain you would survive. What I did not have was any guarantee that the decisions I made now, while I was clear, would be honored later. If I became less clear, I had watched enough of my contemporaries lose that battle. I had seen what happened to men who had built things and then grown old in houses where other people made the decisions. I was not going to let that happen to me. In November 2021, I called James Morrison, who had been my attorney for 19 years, and I told him I wanted to acquire a senior living facility, not to live in, not yet, but to own, to control, to have as a resource that no one could redirect or repurpose without my knowledge, because it would be mine in the only way that actually mattered legally, structurally, on paper. James found Sunrise Gardens within 6 weeks, 100 beds, a skilled nursing wing, a memory care unit, 11 acres in a residential corridor west of Palm Beach. The facility had a strong reputation and a management team that had been in place for 4 years. The asking price was $18.5 million. I toured it on a Tuesday in January 2022 with James and the selling broker, walking the corridors and the common areas and the garden paths between the residential wings. And I thought about Eleanor in her back bedroom with the window open, and about what it meant to have a place that was prepared for you rather than assigned to you. I made the offer that afternoon. The acquisition closed in March 2022 under the name Lockwood Senior Living LLC. Lockwood was Eleanor's maiden name. I had chosen it without deliberation. It was simply the right name, and James did not question it. I appointed Patricia Chen, who had been the facility's director of operations for 3 years, as executive director. She was competent and direct and asked me at our first meeting exactly one personal question: whether I intended to be a hands-on owner. I told her I intended to be an informed one. She said that was the better arrangement, and I agreed with her. Marcus did not know about Sunrise Gardens. Diane did not know. No one in my family knew. Only James Morrison, Patricia Chen, and the attorneys who had handled the closing. I had not concealed it from any malicious intent. I had simply done what I had always done when building something that mattered. I kept it quiet until it was finished, until it was real, until it was mine in every way that counted. What I did not know in March 2022 was that I would need it. I learned early that there is a difference between giving a man what he needs and giving him what he asks for. I did not always know the difference when Marcus was young. By the time I understood it clearly, it was too late to go back and undo what had already been built into him. Marcus was 11 years old when he came to me with a picture he had torn from a magazine, a wooden box with a hinged lid and brass corners, the kind you might keep fishing lures in, or old letters. He said he wanted to make one. I was working 60-hour weeks at the company then, traveling 2 weeks out of every month, and the honest answer was that I did not have the time to teach him. What I said instead was that I would buy him one. I drove to the hobby shop on Military Trail that Saturday and came back with a finished version, nicer than the one in the picture, with a small brass latch and a cedar interior that smelled like the inside of a good closet. Marcus thanked me and put it on his shelf. As far as I know, he never put anything in it. The point had been to make something. I had solved the wrong problem entirely, and I did not realize that until much later. I always wrote the check. That was my solution to most things. And for most of the years Marcus was growing up, it worked well enough that I did not question it. When he struggled in school, I paid for tutors. When he wanted a car at 17, I bought him one. When he applied to the University of Florida and got in, I paid full tuition and covered the apartment in Gainesville without being asked. He left after 3 semesters, and when he called to tell me, I listened to his reasons. The program wasn't right, the city wasn't right, the timing wasn't right, and then I told him we would find something else. We did. He enrolled at Florida Atlantic in Boca Raton 2 years later. He left that program after 4 semesters. I paid for both of them and said nothing about the money because Eleanor asked me not to, and because I believed the way you believe things when you want to, that the next thing would be different. He never had to work to see whether he was capable of it. That was the truth of it. And it is the part I carry, not with resentment toward Marcus, but with a clear-eyed accounting of my own role. Every check I wrote removed one more occasion for him to discover what he was made of. By the time he was 30, he had never held a job longer than 22 months. Not because he was unintelligent, Marcus was perceptive and quick, and when something interested him, he could talk about it for hours. But interest and endurance are not the same thing, and I had never required him to learn the difference. The 3 businesses were spread across 8 years. The first was a craft brewery in Lake Worth, 2011, when Marcus was 28. I put in $180. It lasted 14 months before the partnership dissolved over a disagreement I was never given the full details of. The second was a logistics consulting firm, 2015 his idea, genuinely well conceived, and I gave him $240,000 and believed in it more than I should have. It closed in 18 months. He called me from the parking lot of an office building in Deerfield Beach and said it just hadn't come together. I told him I understood. The third was a residential renovation company he started with a college friend in 2019. I gave him $195,000. By 2021, it was gone. I never asked for any of it back. Eleanor would have wanted me to be patient, and I was patient. But patience is not the same thing as wisdom, and I had confused the two for a long time. He was 33 and working as a regional sales coordinator for a building materials distributor, a decent job. Steady when he met Diane. He brought her to the house in Palm Beach for the first time in the spring of 2015, about 4 months after they had started seeing each other. She was 30 years old, sharp in the way that people who have learned to read rooms quickly are sharp, and she had worked in residential real estate sales for 6 years. She knew what things cost. She knew what they were worth. These are not the same number, and she understood that distinction the way very few people do. The first thing I noticed was her hands. She shook mine firmly and held eye contact, which I respected. The second thing I noticed was that within the first 10 minutes of being in the house, she had looked at my watch, my ring, and then once, briefly at the painting above the fireplace that Eleanor had bought at an auction in Sarasota in 2004. I recognized what she was doing because I had done the same thing in other contexts. She was calculating, not in a panicked way, not even in a dishonest way. She was simply reading the room the way she had been trained to read rooms, and the room told her something she filed away. I did not say anything. I watched her talk to Eleanor about the kitchen renovation we had done 2 years before, and she asked the right questions. And she was genuinely charming. And I thought this woman calculates everything. I did not say that to Eleanor. I should have said it to myself more clearly than I did. They married in October 2016. The wedding was at the Breakers, which Marcus had wanted and Diane had agreed to with a particular kind of agreement, the kind where the person agreeing has already decided the outcome and is simply confirming it. I paid for the wedding. I wrote the check without being asked because Marcus was my son and because Eleanor cried at the ceremony in the way that meant she was genuinely happy. And that was enough for me at the time. They had been married 6 years and there were no children. Diane had said, when Eleanor once asked carefully, that they wanted to build financial stability first. Eleanor had nodded and not pressed. I had nodded too. But I had heard Diane use the phrase once on a phone call with her parents that I was not meant to hear, the kind of accident that happens in a large house when someone forgets that sound carries down a hallway, and the phrase she used was not financial stability. She referred to me, in that conversation, as an investment opportunity. She said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and no longer needs to be lowered. Matter of fact, accurate from her perspective. I was in the kitchen. I'd come down for water. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the counter and listened to her finish the sentence, and then I filled my glass and went back upstairs. I did not confront her. I did not mention it to Marcus. I simply added it to what I already knew about the situation, the way you add a column of figures and note the total without surprise. She calculated everything. I had known it since that first evening in the living room. Now I had the number. 6 months after Eleanor died, the house had 11 rooms, and I was using 3 of them. I ate at the kitchen table where we used to sit together on Sunday mornings. Her with the crossword, me with the business section, neither of us talking much because we didn't need to. I slept on my side of the bed. I kept her reading glasses on the nightstand where she'd left them, because moving them felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. The house was clean. It was quiet. It was exactly the way she would have wanted it, and that was the part that made the quiet unbearable. Marcus called on a Thursday evening in March of 2022. I remember it was Thursday because I had just come back from the grocery store, which I had started doing on Thursday afternoons as a way of giving the week a shape. He said, "Dad, Diane and I have been talking. We want to come stay with you for a while, help out around the house, keep you company." He paused. "We could move in, make it easier for everyone." I asked him what he meant by easier. He said, "You're alone in that house. Dad, it's too big for one person. We want to be there for you." I was 66 years old. I had driven myself to the grocery store that afternoon, carried the bags in without help, and had a conference call with my accountant at 4 o'clock. I was not struggling, but I was alone in that house. And Marcus knew it, and I said yes. They moved in 6 weeks later with 2 SUVs, a storage pod, and a list of furniture they wanted to bring from their apartment in Boca. Diane walked through every room on the first day with her phone out, taking photographs. I assumed she was documenting the space for arrangement purposes. I noted it and said nothing. The study went first. It had been my room since Eleanor and I bought the house drafting table from my engineering years, the filing cabinets with 31 years of company records, the framed survey map of the Palm Beach waterfront that I'd had since 1989. Marcus came to me in October and said the room would make a better home office for Diane's real estate work. He said it pleasantly, the way he said most things. He said there was a perfectly good space near the back of the house that I could use instead. I moved my files to the back room in 2 afternoons. I did not argue. I noted the date in a small green notebook I had started keeping in the drawer of my nightstand. The second garage bay went in December. I had kept it clear for the Buick, the one I drove on weekdays, because the driveway gravel was rough on the paint in direct sun. Marcus said Diane's clients sometimes came to the house, and the Buick in the drive looked he searched for the word informal. I moved the Buick to the driveway. I noted the date. In February of 2023, Diane had the 4 paintings from the hallway moved to the storage unit they rented on Military Trail. 3 of them were Eleanor's watercolors she had collected over 20 years, pieces she had chosen herself and hung in that specific order for reasons she had explained to me once on a Sunday afternoon. I remember she pointed to each one and described exactly why they belonged where they were. Diane replaced them with prints she ordered online, large format, neutral tones. They arrived in flat boxes and went up in an afternoon while I was out. I noted the date when I got home. I did not say anything about the watercolors. By the middle of 2023, the kitchen table where Eleanor and I had eaten Sunday breakfast had become Diane's primary workspace. Her laptop, her listing binders, her color-coded folders. She worked there from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. And during those hours, the table was not available for eating. I had started taking my breakfast to the back porch. It was not unpleasant. The porch faced the garden, and Eleanor had planted gardenias along the south wall that still bloomed in season. But it was the back of the house, and I had been moved there incrementally over 18 months, and I was clear-eyed enough to recognize what that meant. In September of 2023, Diane's parents listed their house in Port St. Lucie. I learned this from Susan Chen herself, who mentioned it during a Sunday dinner as though I already knew. She said they were looking forward to being closer to family. She said the Port St. Lucie house had always been too large for just the 2 of them. David nodded and said the timing worked out well. No one looked at me when they said this. I noted the date that evening. The green notebook had 14 entries by then. In January of 2024, I called James Morrison. He had handled Eleanor's estate, and before that, he had done the closing paperwork when we bought the house in 2009. He was a careful man, the kind who read documents twice and asked questions in a specific order. I told him I wanted to discuss protecting my future. I said I had been thinking about what my life would look like in 10 years, and I wanted to make certain that I controlled the terms of it. He asked me what I had in mind. I told him I wanted to buy a care facility, a residential one. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me why. I said, because I want to choose where I live when I can no longer live alone. I want to make that decision myself, now while I still can. I don't want it made for me. Morrison said that was a wise decision. He said he would begin researching available properties and ownership structures. He asked me whether I had a price range in mind. I told him I did. I told him I had been liquid for 2 years since selling the company, and that I wanted something established, something with a good reputation, something in Palm Beach County. He said he would get back to me within the week. I drove home on Southern Boulevard with the windows down. The gardenias would be blooming again in 3 months. I thought about that, and about Eleanor, and about the green notebook in my nightstand drawer, and about the column of figures I had been adding up for 18 months. The total was not a surprise. It never had been. The study had been Eleanor's idea, not the room itself, the function. She had watched me work at the kitchen table for 31 years, contracts spread across the surface she was trying to set for dinner. And one afternoon in 2007, she had pointed to the corner room on the east side of the house and said, quietly, that she thought it should be mine. We spent a Saturday moving in a mahogany desk I had bought at an estate sale in Boca, and she hung 2 of her paintings on the wall herself, a watercolor of the Intracoastal at dawn, and a small oil of a blue heron standing in shallow water that she had bought from a painter named Carl Wessler at the West Palm Beach Art Fair. She said the light in that room was good in the mornings. She was right. It was the room where I had worked every morning for 15 years, and where I had sat for a long time after we buried her. Marcus and Diane moved in during the first week of September 2022. They arrived with a moving truck and a decorator's consultation already scheduled. And within 3 weeks, Diane had walked through every room in the house with a clipboard and a measuring tape. I watched her from the hallway. She did not ask me to join her. The study came up on a Tuesday evening in October. Diane said the room on the east side had good light and would work better as her home office. She said it pleasantly, the way she said most things, not as a question, not as a request, but as an observation about the natural order of things. I was sitting at the desk when she said it. The blue heron painting was behind her on the wall. I moved my files to a shelf in the guest room that same week. I moved the mahogany desk to the garage, where it sat covered with the dropcloth. The study became Diane's office. She put a standing desk where mine had been and hung a print she had ordered online where Eleanor's watercolor used to hang. I did not comment on any of it. I moved my morning coffee to the kitchen table, the same surface I had worked at for 31 years before Eleanor pointed to that corner room, and I sat there in the mornings and looked out at the backyard and did not say anything about it. The paintings came next. Eleanor had collected them over 20 years, local artists, mostly painters she had found at weekend markets and small gallery shows along Clematis Street. She had not bought them as investments. She had bought them because she liked looking at them. By the time she died, there were 11 of them in the house, and I knew the name of the artist who had painted each one. Carl Wessler, a woman named Renata Diaz who worked in oils and lived in Lake Worth, a man named Thomas Abad, whose landscapes of the Everglades hung in the dining room. I knew what Eleanor had paid for each one, and I knew what she had said when she chose it. In the spring of 2023, Diane told me she had found a buyer for the Renata Diaz pieces, 2 small oils that had hung in the upstairs hallway for 12 years. She said the house needed refreshing. She said the style was dated. I asked her whether she was planning to sell Eleanor's paintings. She said we needed the money to redecorate. She said it as though the answer explained itself. I did not respond. I went to my room, the guest room, by then, though no one had said so directly, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the green notebook on the nightstand. I opened it and wrote down the date and what Diane had said, word for word. Then I wrote down the names of the 2 Diaz pieces. Then I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. Over the following 4 months, 7 of Eleanor's paintings left the house. The Diaz oils went first, then the 2 Abad landscapes from the dining room, then 3 others I had watched her choose herself at shows I had driven her to on Saturday mornings. Diane sold them through a reseller she had found online. The total came to $42,000. I know the figure because I looked up the transaction records later, when I had reason to. The Blue Heron by Carl Wessler stayed on the wall in what had been my study and was now Diane's office. I did not know whether she had simply not gotten around to it or whether she had decided to keep it. I did not ask. The interior designer arrived in August of 2023. Her name was Linda Farrow, and she came with fabric samples and a portfolio and a young assistant who photographed every room. Diane walked her through the house while I sat in the kitchen. At some point, Linda Farrow came into the kitchen to take measurements of the window trim, and she looked at me and said, very politely, that she hoped I was comfortable and that she would try not to be in the way of the guests. I told her I was fine. She smiled and went back to measuring. Diane, standing in the doorway, did not correct her. She moved on to the next room with Linda Farrow and the assistant, and I heard them discussing the kitchen cabinets and whether the island should be replaced. I sat at the table and finished my coffee. A guest in my own home. I wrote that down later too, in the green notebook, though I did not need to. I was not going to forget it. By 2024, Marcus had begun making structural decisions about the house without consulting me. In February, he had the front door replace the original mahogany door that Eleanor had chosen when we built the house, swapped for a fiberglass panel that Marcus said was more energy efficient. He told me about it after the installation crew had left. In April, he contracted a painter to redo the exterior, changing the color from the pale yellow Eleanor had picked in 2009 to a gray that Diane had seen in a design magazine. I came home from an appointment to find 2 men on ladders and the old color half gone from the south wall. In June, the heating system was replaced. I received a text message from Marcus informing me that the work would take 2 days and that I should plan accordingly. I read the text message twice. Then I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked out at the backyard, at the bougainvillea along the fence that Eleanor had planted in the first year we lived there. It was still the same color she had chosen. No one had gotten to it yet. I opened the green notebook and wrote down the date of each change, the contractor's name where I had it, and the approximate cost. I had been keeping that column for 18 months. The total was considerable. I added the new figures and closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer next to the bed that had once been a guest bed and was now the only bed I slept in. I said nothing to Marcus. I said nothing to Diane. I had learned, in 31 years of running a company that supplied industrial equipment to facilities across 3 states, that the most useful thing you can do when someone is showing you exactly who they are is to pay close attention and say very little. The notebook was almost full. I had already bought a second one. The guest house was Eleanor's idea. Originally, not the building itself, the building had always been there. A 2-room structure at the far end of the property that we'd used for storage, and, once, for a college friend of Marcus's who needed a place to land for 3 weeks and stayed for 4 months. But Eleanor had talked about converting it properly, making it a real space, somewhere a guest could stay with dignity. She never got around to it. After she died, I had a contractor come in and finish what she'd described proper insulation, a bathroom with a walk-in shower, a small kitchen counter with a 2-burner stove. I did it because it felt like completing something she'd started. I wasn't thinking about who would live there. Marcus brought it up on a Sunday morning in late March. He and Diane were sitting at the kitchen table when I came in from the yard, and Marcus said they'd been talking, and they thought the guest house might be better for me. Quieter, better for my sleep, he said. Less foot traffic, Diane said the back of the property got a good cross breeze in the evenings. She said it as though she had studied the wind patterns. I stood by the counter and looked at them both and thought about the notebook in my bedside drawer, which by that point had 46 pages of entries. I said it sounded fine. I want to be precise about why I agreed. It was not because I believed them. It was not because I thought a two-room structure at the back of my own property was an appropriate place for a 69-year-old man to live. It was because I understood, standing there with my coffee going cold, that the guest house would give me something the main house no longer could distance: walls between me and whatever was being decided in rooms I was no longer welcome in. And distance, in my experience, is not always a disadvantage. I moved my things over on a Wednesday. It took 2 trips with a handcart. I brought the photograph of Eleanor from the nightstand, the one taken on the back porch of this house 14 months before she died, the one where she's laughing at something just outside the frame. I put it on the windowsill of the guest house where it would catch the morning light. I brought the second notebook, which was not yet full, and I put it in the drawer of the small desk that barely fit between the window and the wall. Marcus and Diane's parents moved into the main house the following weekend. David and Susan Chen had sold their place in Port St. Lucie and arrived with a moving truck and a confidence I found interesting to observe. Susan rearranged the kitchen within 48 hours. David set up what he called a workbench in the garage that had housed my car for 22 years. I heard them through the guest house window at night, not words. Just the low register of conversation, the particular sound of people who believe they are making plans in private. I was not invited to those conversations. When Marcus and Diane made decisions about the property, the resurfacing of the pool deck, the replacement of the side gate, the removal of a bougainvillea that Eleanor had planted along the south fence, I heard about them after the fact, or I did not hear about them at all. Once I came back from my morning walk to find 2 men I didn't recognize removing the bougainvillea with a truck and a chain. I stood on the path and watched them work. One of them nodded at me the way you nod at a neighbor. I nodded back. I wrote it down that evening, including the name on the side of the truck. Marcus had begun referring to the property as our house, not in conversation with me. He was careful about that at first. But I heard it through the screen door one afternoon when he was on the phone with someone, and I heard it again when Diane was speaking to her mother in the kitchen. Our house. The word landed the way small words do when they carry a great deal of weight. The call from Patricia Chen came on a Thursday afternoon in June, 3 months before the dinner party. I was sitting at the small desk in the guest house with the second notebook open in front of me. My phone rang, and when I answered, she introduced herself as the facility manager of Sunrise Gardens and said they were approaching the completion of all administrative procedures. Her voice was efficient and warm in equal measure. She said the facility would be ready to receive residents at any time. I told her I would not be residing there. I told her I was the owner. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of confusion, the silence of someone recalibrating. Then she said, "I understand. Mr. Ashford, I wasn't certain of the arrangement." I told her the arrangement was straightforward. I told her my son was unaware that I held the ownership. I told her that when the time came, I would need her to be available to confirm certain details, and that I would give her sufficient notice. I asked if she was comfortable with that. Patricia Chen said, "You can count on me, Mr. Ashford." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat for a moment looking at the photograph of Eleanor on the windowsill. The morning light had shifted by that hour, and the frame was in shadow. I picked up the second notebook and wrote the date, the time, and Patricia's name. Then I wrote, "He has no idea." I underlined it once, closed the notebook, and put it back in the drawer. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, my phone rang at 9:40. The number was Carol Whitfield's. She had lived in the house directly east of the property for 22 years, and she had been Eleanor's friend before she was mine. I picked up. She said, "Rob, I don't want to make something out of nothing, but I thought you should know." I said, "Tell me." "Yesterday afternoon," she said, "around 3 o'clock, Marcus was here with a woman I didn't recognize, not Diane. Younger, she had a portfolio bag, the kind the real estate people carry. They walked the perimeter of the Sunrise Gardens property on Congress. She was taking photographs. Marcus was pointing things out to her, the parking structure, the east wing, the garden path along the back. She paused. He looked like he was showing someone around a property he was planning to sell. I did not say anything for a moment. Carol said, "I could be wrong about what I saw." "You're not wrong," I said. She was quiet for a beat. Then, "Is everything all right?" "Rob." I told her everything was proceeding exactly as I expected. I told her I was grateful she had called. She said she hoped she hadn't overstepped, and I told her she had done the right thing. And I meant it. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand and looked out of the guest house window at the back garden. The gardenias along the south wall were in bloom. Marcus had toured Sunrise Gardens not as a concerned son researching care options, but as a man walking a property with someone who assessed value for a living. He had done it on a Saturday afternoon in broad daylight, in a neighborhood where my neighbor of 22 years could see him from her driveway. He did not know that Carol Whitfield had my number. He did not know that Sunrise Gardens was not a facility to be toured. He did not know that the woman with the portfolio bag had been photographing a building that, on paper, belonged entirely to me. I opened the second notebook and wrote Carol's name, the date, the time, and what she had described. I wrote the word portfolio. I wrote, "He is moving faster than I expected. Good." Then I called James Morrison and told him we needed to move the meeting up by 1 week. The library had been my room before it was anyone else's. I'd built the shelves myself in 1998 over a long weekend while Eleanor painted the trim in the kitchen. She kept calling through the doorway to ask if I wanted more coffee, and I kept saying yes even when I didn't, just to hear her voice. The shelves were still there. The books were still there, but Marcus had moved my reading chair to the corner and replaced it with a larger desk. And Diane had stacked her real estate catalogs across the bottom 2 shelves where I used to keep my engineering references. That Thursday in March, 3 months ago, I went into the main house after 9. I needed a specific book, a volume on Florida property law I'd bought in 2001 and had been meaning to pull for a week. I knew exactly which shelf. I'd left the guest house light on and crossed the patio quietly. The back door was unlocked, as it usually was by then. I had stopped pointing that out. The lights in the library were off. I didn't turn them on. I knew the room well enough to navigate by the light coming through the hallway, and I found the shelf without difficulty. I had the book in my hand when I heard Marcus's voice from the study across the hall. The door was partially open. He was on the phone, and he was not speaking quietly. I stood still. "We've already decided," he said. "Dad's going to need professional care within the next year or 2. We've been looking at options. There's Sunrise Gardens over on Clematis, and there's Whitmore Care out near the county line. Both are well regarded. Both are close enough for us to visit." I heard Diane's voice then, lower, filling in the space after Marcus finished. She said, "We'll tell him over the summer. He'll push back, you know how he is, but we'll explain that it's the best arrangement for everyone, for his safety, for his health. He'll understand eventually." A third voice came through the speaker, slightly compressed by the call. David Chen, Diane's father. He asked whether I would accept that kind of decision being made for me. His tone was not hostile. He sounded like a man trying to be practical, working through logistics, the way you'd discuss a property sale or a renovation schedule. Diane answered him. She said he won't have a choice. By the time we have that conversation, he'll be isolated enough and dependent enough on us that he'll agree. He doesn't have anywhere else to go. I stood in the dark and listened to every word. I did not move. I did not adjust my grip on the book. The room was approximately 62 degrees. I had noticed the thermostat earlier in the week, set lower than I kept it, and I was aware of the cold in a distant, cataloged way. The way you notice something without deciding to notice it. I counted the seconds between sentences. I heard Marcus confirm the name again as Sunrise Gardens and say they had already taken a tour. I heard Diane tell her parents they could begin planning the move to Palm Beach once the transition was finalized. The call ended. I heard Marcus set his phone down on the desk. I heard Diane say something I couldn't make out, and Marcus laugh once, briefly. I left the library without turning on a light. I went back across the patio and let myself into the guest house. I set the property law book on the table by the door. I did not sit down immediately. I stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then I turned off the lamp I had left on and sat in the dark. I sat there for 2 hours. I was not thinking about what to do. I already knew what to do, James Morrison, and I had been building toward it for months, and the framework was largely in place. What I was doing, in that dark room, was something different. I was letting it settle. I was letting the full shape of it become clear without any distortion from anger or urgency. I have found, over 69 years, that clarity is not something you reach by moving faster. It arrives when you stop. My son had toured Sunrise Gardens. He had discussed the timeline. He had decided, with his wife and her parents, that I would be isolated enough and dependent enough to agree. He had no idea that I had been to Sunrise Gardens too, that I had signed documents there, that Patricia Chen reported to me. I sat in the dark and let that fact rest in the room alongside everything else. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like the last piece of a structure finally bearing its full weight the moment when you know the foundation will hold, not because you hope it will, but because you built it yourself. When the 2 hours had passed, I turned on the lamp. I opened the second notebook to a fresh page. I wrote the date, the names, and the words I had heard. I wrote them exactly as they had been spoken, in the order they had been spoken without commentary. Then I closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer. I picked up the phone and sent James Morrison a single text message. It said, "We're ready to move." I woke at 5:15 without an alarm. The bedroom was still dark, and the ceiling fan turned at its lowest speed, the same speed Eleanor had preferred on humid mornings. I lay there for a moment, listening to the house. No sounds from the guest wing. I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table until the light came through the east windows. Then I picked up the phone and called James Morrison. He answered on the second ring. It was 6:41 in the morning, and he did not sound surprised. I told him what I had heard the previous evening. I told him the names, the plan, the timeline. I told him about David and Susan Chen arriving within the month, about the Sunrise Gardens brochure Diane had left open on the counter, about the phrase Marcus had used, the next logical step. I told him all of it in the same order I had written it in the notebook, without commentary. When I finished, Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "Crystal clear," I said. He said he would begin preparing the documentation that afternoon. I told him what I wanted. I said, "I want to organize a family meeting. I want everyone there, Marcus, Diane, her parents. I want you there. I want Patricia Chen there. I want it at your office." Morrison asked me what I intended to announce. I said, "I want to announce that I own Sunrise Gardens. I want to announce that I have been prepared for some time. And I want my son to understand that everything he said last night was, in fact, a full account of his intentions toward my future." Morrison did not respond immediately. I could hear him writing. After a moment, he said, "That's a clean play. Rob." I told him to schedule it for the following week. I asked him to send the invitations as a standard estate planning meeting, nothing that would alarm anyone or give them time to prepare a counterposition. After I hung up with Morrison, I called Patricia Chen. She picked up on the third ring. I told her the meeting was set, that I needed her present, and that she should bring the full ownership summary. She asked, "How long do we have?" "1 week," I said. "After that, everything changes." She said she would be ready. I set the phone down on the table and finished my coffee. Outside, the yard was bright now, the bougainvillea catching the early light along the south wall. Eleanor had planted that bougainvillea the second spring we owned the house. She had said it would take 3 years to climb the wall properly. She had been right about that, and about most things. I rinsed the cup and left it on the rack. I sent the text to Marcus at 8:47 that morning. No preamble, no explanation, just the information he needed and nothing more. Family meeting. Next Thursday, 1 p.m., James Morrison's office. Everyone attends. Marcus called back within 4 minutes. I let it ring twice before I picked up. He said, "What's this about, Dad?" I said, "About the future of this family, about the house, about me." There was a pause. I could hear Diane's voice in the background, low and quick, asking something. Marcus said, "Can you be more specific?" I said, "Thursday, 2 o'clock, Morrison's office." Then I ended the call. I know what happened after that because Patricia Chen told me later, and because people who are frightened are not careful about where they make their phone calls. Marcus and Diane called David and Susan Chen within the hour. I know this because David Chen called me directly that same afternoon, a call I did not answer, and left a voicemail that ran for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Most of it polite questions wrapped around a single anxious core. What did I want? What was I planning? Was there something they should know? I listened to the message once, saved it, and did not call back. What Marcus had told his in-laws, I learned later, was that he wasn't sure what I wanted, but that it was probably about money, that I'd been acting strange, that the meeting was at a lawyer's office, which meant it was serious, which meant they should probably be there. He told them to drive up from Port St. Lucie the night before so they'd have time to prepare. Prepare for what? He didn't say. He didn't know. That was the point. I spent the days before Thursday the way I have always spent the days before something important, doing ordinary things with ordinary care. I ate breakfast at the same time each morning. I walked the perimeter of the property in the early light, the way I had done for 11 years, checking the fence line and the irrigation along the south beds. On Tuesday, I met with Morrison for 40 minutes to review the final order of documents. On Wednesday afternoon, I drove out to Sunrise Gardens and walked the grounds with Patricia for the last time before the meeting. Not because I needed to verify anything, but because I wanted to remember what the place looked like when it was simply a facility I owned, before it became something else in the telling. Patricia walked beside me along the east corridor, past the activity room where 3 residents were working a jigsaw puzzle at a long table. She said, "They'll be surprised." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you nervous?" I thought about that for a moment. The word didn't fit. I said, "No. I've been waiting for the right moment for a long time. I'm not nervous about the moment arriving." She nodded. We walked back through the main entrance, past the reception desk where a young woman named Carla had worked every weekday morning for the past 2 years, and Patricia stopped to confirm the document folder was locked in her office. Carla looked up and smiled. She had no idea what the folder contained. She would know by Friday. That evening, I came home to a house that was quieter than usual. Marcus and Diane had taken their car somewhere dinner, I assumed, or perhaps a visit to whatever attorney they'd managed to reach on short notice. I didn't ask. I went to the kitchen, made a simple dinner, and ate at the table by the window that looks out over the back garden. Eleanor had chosen that table. She had spent 3 Saturdays looking at tables before she found it, and when she brought me to the shop to approve it, she had already decided. She showed me the table and said, "What do you think?" I said I thought it was the right table. She said, "I knew you'd say that." She was right. She usually was. After I ate, I went to the study and sat in the chair behind the desk where I had spent the better part of 31 years making decisions. The photograph of Eleanor was on the shelf to my left, the one taken the summer we bought this house, before the bougainvillea had grown in and before the back fence was painted. She was standing in the garden with her hand shading her eyes, looking at something past the camera, smiling. She had 14 months in this house, 14 months of the garden she had planned for years, the kitchen she had designed, the table she had chosen, 14 months before the diagnosis, and 7 after that. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I said quietly, to the room, "I'm going to take back my life. I'm going to take back this house. I'm going to take back my future." I did not feel dramatic saying it. I felt clear. That was the only word for it, the same clarity I had felt the morning I signed the papers on the Sunrise Gardens acquisition. The same clarity I had felt the first day I opened Ashford Industrial Supply with 12 employees and a lease on a warehouse in Riviera Beach. Not excitement, not anger, just the particular stillness of a man who has made a decision and finished making it. I slept without difficulty. Thursday morning, I was up at 5:30. I made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen window, and watched the light come up over the back garden. The bougainvillea was deep red in the early sun. I left the cup on the rack and went upstairs to dress. The suit was charcoal wool, the one I had bought for Eleanor's memorial service and worn twice, since once to close the sale of the company, once to a dinner with a city commissioner who had wanted to discuss the Sunrise Gardens zoning variance. The Rolex had been my father's. He had given it to me the year I started the company, not as a gift exactly, but as a statement of expectation. I had worn it to every significant meeting of my professional life. The gold ring on my right hand was the one Eleanor had given me on our 35th anniversary, a plain band with a single small inscription on the inside that I had never shown anyone. I put it on the way I always did, without looking. I was in my car by 12:40. Morrison's office was on Flagler Drive, 22 minutes from the house in ordinary traffic. I arrived at 1:45, which was 15 minutes before the meeting and 40 minutes before Marcus and Diane were likely to arrive. Morrison was already in the conference room when I came in, his jacket on, 2 sets of documents laid out on the table with the precision of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and understood that the physical arrangement of paper communicates something before a single word is spoken. Patricia Chen was seated to his left, her own folder closed in front of her, dressed in the charcoal blazer she wore to board presentations. She looked up when I walked in and gave a single nod. Morrison said, "Ready." I set my jacket on the back of the chair at the head of the table, the chair I had sat in for every meeting in this office for the past 9 years, and said, "I've been ready for a long time." Morrison checked the time. "They'll be here in 35 minutes. I said, "I know." I sat down. Patricia pushed a glass of water toward me. Outside the window, Flagler Drive was bright and ordinary, palm trees casting short shadows in the early afternoon light. A man walked past on the sidewalk with a coffee cup and a phone, not looking up. I folded my hands on the table and waited. They arrived at 12 minutes past 2. Marcus came in first, wearing the navy blazer I had bought him for his law school graduation interview, the one he never needed because he never finished the application. He had the walk of a man who believed the meeting was a formality. Diane was half a step behind him, her posture composed, her handbag over one arm. She had dressed for a negotiation. Behind them came David and Susan Chen, David in a pressed shirt, Susan with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. They had driven up from Port St. Lucie that morning. I had been told they were planning to list their house by the end of the month. Marcus scanned the room. He saw Morrison. He saw Patricia. He saw me sitting at the head of the table, and I watched something flicker across his face. Not quite uncertainty, but a brief recalculation. The way a man adjusts his footing when the floor is not quite level. Then he smiled. "Dad," he said, "you brought a whole team." I did not answer. I gestured toward the chairs. They sat. David Chen looked at the folders on the table. Susan looked at Patricia, then at me. Diane set her handbag on the floor beside her chair with a small, deliberate motion, as if she were settling in for something that would take time but not go badly. Morrison cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. Mr. Ashford asked me to arrange this meeting to discuss some legal matters relating to his estate and his assets. I want to make clear from the outset that everything discussed here is on the record, and that I am acting solely in Mr. Ashford's interest." He paused. I'll let him speak first. Every head at the table turned toward me. I had been in this position before, not this room, not this table, but this exact position, sitting across from people who had already decided what was going to happen, who had already written the outcome in their heads, and were simply waiting for the world to catch up. I had been in rooms like this with suppliers who thought they had me cornered on pricing, with contractors who thought a delayed permit would break a project, with a bank officer in 1991 who told me he didn't see a path to approval. I had learned, over 31 years, that the men who talked first in those rooms were usually the men who had already lost. I looked at Marcus. 3 years ago, I said, I purchased Sunrise Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation Center. I purchased it through a holding company called Lockwood Senior Living, LLC. I am the sole owner of that company. I am the sole owner of that facility. Every financial decision, every staffing decision, every operational policy, all of it flows through my signature." The room was quiet. Marcus's smile was still there, but it had stopped moving. It had the quality of something that had been painted on and was now waiting for instructions. Diane said, "I'm sorry, what?" She looked at Marcus, then at Morrison, then back at me. When she spoke again, her voice had recovered its composure, the particular composure of a woman who has spent 6 years reading rooms and deciding which way they would go. "Rob," she said, "I think there may be some confusion here. Sunrise Gardens is a care facility. You're describing an ownership arrangement that, frankly, that doesn't change what we were trying to do for you. We were looking out for your future. That was the entire point." I looked at her. "You were looking out for my future," I said, "in a facility I have owned for 3 years, on a property where I hold every deed, under the authority of a director who reports to me." I paused. "The only person in this room who needed looking after was you." I continued, 4 days ago, at a dinner in my own home, in front of 17 people, including my neighbor Carol Whitfield, my accountant Ted Brennan, and 4 people I have known for more than 20 years, my son told the room that I should be placed in Sunrise Gardens. I let that sit for one moment. He did not know that he was recommending I move into a property I have owned for 3 years. He did not know that he was suggesting I place myself under the authority of a facility where I am, in fact, the authority. Marcus said, "Dad, that's not what I haven't finished." He stopped. "My son told 17 people that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. He said it pleasantly. He said it with concern in his voice. He said it in the dining room that his mother chose, in front of the painting she picked out in Savannah, at the table where she sat every Christmas morning for 14 months before she died. I did not raise my voice. I had no need to. I want everyone in this room to understand what that evening actually was. It was not a son expressing concern. It was a declaration. It was the moment my son and his wife decided that the last step was in place." Diane's jaw tightened. "This is completely—" Patricia Chen stood up. She'd been sitting at the far end of the table, the folder in front of her closed, her hands folded. She stood with the particular composure of a person who has run difficult meetings and is not impressed by volume. She opened the folder and set it in the center of the table. "My name is Patricia Chen. I am the Executive Director of Sunrise Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, located at 4800 Congress Avenue in West Palm Beach. I've held that position for 4 years." She looked at Marcus, then at Diane, then at David and Susan Chen in turn. "Mr. Robert Ashford is the owner of record of Sunrise Gardens, through Lockwood Senior Living LLC, registered in the state of Florida. Every budget approval, every capital expenditure, every change in executive staffing for the past 3 years has been authorized by Mr. Ashford directly. I have worked for him since the acquisition closed." She paused. "The documents in front of you confirm ownership, operating authority, and the current valuation of the facility, which, as of last quarter, stands at approximately $4.8 million. Susan Chen made a small sound. David Chen looked down at the folder, then up at me, then at his daughter. Diane said, "Patricia, I think there may be some confusion about—" "There is no confusion," Patricia said. She sat back down. David Chen put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Susan. Something passed between them, not a word, not a gesture, but the particular silence of 2 people who have been married long enough to have entire conversations without speaking. David pushed back his chair. "We should go," he said. Susan stood immediately. Diane reached across and gripped her father's arm. "Baba, we can't just leave in the middle of—" "We were not invited to a discussion," David said. His voice was even. He was looking at Diane with an expression I recognized, not anger, but the specific exhaustion of a parent who has seen something they cannot unsee. "We were brought here to be part of something." He looked at me. "I owe you an apology, Rob." I said, "You don't." "I do." He said, "Susan and we were told this was about making sure you were cared for. We didn't ask enough questions." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "We're listing our house because our daughter told us there would be room for us. I see now what that arrangement was actually built on." Susan touched my hand once briefly as she passed behind my chair. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They walked out. The door didn't slam. It closed with a quiet final click. Diane stared at the door for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back to the table. Her composure was still there, but it had shifted the way a foundation shifts, invisibly at first, until the cracks show in the walls above. Marcus said, "Beau, toy," and then caught himself, and said it again in English, "Dad, I know," I said. He stopped. "I know what you were going to say. You were going to tell me you were worried. You were going to tell me it came from love. You might even believe that." I looked at him, not at the blazer, not at the performance of the man he had constructed over 41 years of never being required to build anything himself, but at him. "I paid for your school, every year of it. I paid for the car you drove at 22, and the apartment you lived in at 25, and the down payment on the house you sold at 33. I wrote every check. I made every call. I smoothed every road." I paused. "I did all of that because I loved your mother. And she loved you. And I thought that was what a father was supposed to do. I was wrong about one part of it. I never taught you that the road ends somewhere. I never taught you that there is a point at which a man stands on his own, or he doesn't stand at all." Marcus's face had done what I expected it to do. The confidence had drained out of it the way water drains from a glass slowly at first, then all at once. What was left was something younger and considerably less certain. "You will learn that today," I said, "not because I am punishing you, because it is simply true." Morrison placed a document on the table. He did not announce it. He simply set it down and stepped back. "Mr. Ashford amended his estate documents 14 months ago," Morrison said. "The amendment is straightforward. In the event that any attempt is made legal, medical, or otherwise to remove Mr. Ashford's control over his assets, his residence, or his personal decision-making, the entirety of his estate transfers automatically to a charitable trust. The trust is already established and funded with an initial deposit. The beneficiaries are 3 organizations Mr. Ashford selected personally." Morrison looked at Marcus and Diane. "There is no provision for contest. The amendment was drafted, witnessed, and notarized under Florida law. I can answer procedural questions, but I cannot change what it says." Diane looked at the document. She looked at it the way you look at something when you are trying to find the edge of it, the place where it gives. Her hand moved toward it, stopped, and settled back into her lap. Marcus said, "Diane." "Don't," she said quietly. "Just that one word." I stood up. My jacket was still on the back of the chair. I picked it up, folded it over my arm, and looked at my son one last time across the width of that table. "I will be in the guest house for as long as I choose to be," I said. "When I am ready to make a different arrangement, I will make it. I will make it myself, on my own terms, with my own attorney, in my own time." I put on my jacket. Sunrise Gardens is a good facility. Patricia runs it well. If either of you ever needs it, I'll see that you're treated fairly. I walked to the door. Morrison was already there. Patricia fell into step beside me. Behind me, I heard Diane say Marcus's name once, sharply, in the tone of a person who has just realized that the plan they spent 2 years building was constructed on a floor that belonged to someone else the entire time. I did not turn around. Morrison held the door. The hallway outside was bright and cool and smelled like the same recycled air it always had. Patricia walked beside me to the elevator without speaking. When the doors opened, she stepped in and turned around and looked at me with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something they will be describing for years. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth a great deal," I said. The elevator descended. Outside, Flagler Drive was still bright, still ordinary, the same palm trees, the same short shadows, A different afternoon than the one I had walked into this building carrying 3 years ago. When I signed the papers for a nursing home, I bought not out of anger and not out of spite, but because I had watched what happened to men who let other people hold the deed to their last years, and I had decided, quietly and without announcement, that I would not be one of them. Eleanor had always said I planned for everything. She was right about that too. I walked to my car. I did not check my phone. I drove home on the same road I had driven for 11 years, past the same banyans, past the same pale stucco walls, past the gatehouse where the guard waved without needing to check my name. The house was quiet when I got back. The guest house key was in my jacket pocket. I sat on the back terrace for a while, facing the garden Eleanor had planted in the spring of the year she died, and I drank a glass of water. And I did not think about Marcus or Diane or the look on David Chen's face when he finally understood. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about 14 months. Then I went inside because there were things to do, and they were mine to do, and I had time. The following Monday, Morrison filed the formal notice with the county clerk. On Wednesday morning, a process server delivered 2 copies to the Cypress Lane address, one for Marcus, one for Diane. The notice was straightforward. As sole owner of the property at Cypress Lane, I was exercising my right to reclaim primary occupancy. Marcus and Diane had 30 days to vacate. The guest house, where I had been living for 8 months, was not subject to the notice. The main house was. Morrison told me later that Marcus had called his office 4 times between Wednesday afternoon and Thursday morning. He did not take the calls. There was nothing to discuss. The document said what it said. David and Susan Chen had already been in contact with their real estate agent in Port St. Lucie by Tuesday evening. Carol Whitfield told me this. She had spoken to Susan at the garden center on Thursday, and Susan had said, very simply, that their plans had changed and they would be staying in Port St. Lucie. She had not elaborated. Carol said Susan looked tired. The way people look when they have been carrying something they are glad to set down. The Palm Beach arrangement, the one Diane had described to her parents as the next logical step, the one that had brought David and Susan north with a moving truck and a confidence I had found interesting to observe, was finished. They did not list their house. They did not move. The room they had been promised did not exist in any form that would survive the next 30 days. The paintings were a separate matter, and a smaller one, but I resolved it the same week. Diane had sold 7 of Eleanor's pieces through an online reseller over the previous 2 years. The total from those transactions was $42,000. Morrison sent a formal letter to Diane's business address, itemizing each piece by title, artist, and sale date, and noting that the paintings had been sold without my knowledge or consent from a property I owned. The letter did not threaten litigation. It did not need to. It simply stated the facts and invited a response within 14 days. No response came. Morrison filed the civil claim on day 15. I did not expect to recover the paintings. They were gone, and I knew it. But the $42,000 was a number I intended to see again, and I was patient about timelines. The Blue Heron by Carl Wessler was still on the wall in what had been my study. On the Friday after the meeting, I went into the main house for the first time since moving to the guest house. The rooms were the same. The prints Diane had ordered online were still on the walls. The kitchen table where Eleanor and I had eaten Sunday breakfast was still covered in listing binders and color-coded folders. I went to the study. The Blue Heron was where it had always been, small oil on canvas. The bird standing in shallow water, the light coming from the left the way Carl Wessler always painted it. I lifted it off the wall, carried it down the hall, and hung it back in the corner of the library where Eleanor had first put it, on the wall beside the east window where the morning light came straight across. I stepped back and looked at it for a moment. Then I went to make coffee. If you have ever watched someone you love build something carefully, not just a house or a business, but a life, a set of choices made quietly over decades, and then watched other people treat it as something to be divided up and taken, you already understand why a man like this doesn't raise his voice. The silence isn't surrender. It never was. If these stories find something true in you, I'll be here.